How is he not dead?
I just got drilled.
Oh,
What the
just-
fuck? Man?
Let's just go over.
Nice.
Oh, really?
What the shot? Where was that? Where
Oh,
was
this
that?
guy.
He's gonna be going over wall. He's going over wall, left. Great work, great work.
No, he's there.
Hold.
I'm here. Jordan.
Yeah.
They have to leave red. They have to leave red.
This feels weird, doesn't it? Seeing this footage, seeing the SPR, seeing Verdansk in an area with guns and movement, and entire gameplay systems that just feel like an alien world to what we're playing today. And it's not even nostalgia, really in a lot of ways. The Warzone that released back in 2020 is radically different to the Warzone we're playing today in 2024. Now, I'm going to start this video by being a little bit cringy, because I genuinely thought I was going to sit here for like at least 10-15 minutes talking about the number of radical ways that Verdansk would need to be redesigned to fit omnimovement. And to some extent, I will still be talking about that. But honestly, after going back and watching this footage and seeing Verdansk back in the day, I can't help but miss it a little bit. And I can't tell if that's just the general nostalgia from the fact that the game was much simpler, the game didn't have everybody doing pure Adderall 360-degree movement, we didn't have messes every 5 seconds, and that it was just an easier, simpler, and more enjoyable time to have fun in Warzone. Or if it was just the fact that Verdansk was actually a lot better than I remember, and it wasn't this open-spaced mess to some extent. Now let me clarify. Verdansk does have a lot of open space, which we will be talking about in this video, that definitely is a little incompatible with current day Warzone, and a few design choices that I feel need some modernizing to bring the game up to standard with what players are expecting going into 2025. Honestly, Verdansk had some really iconic points of interest, some of which were actually really well made and were a lot of fun that produced very unique gameplay. One of the biggest complaints about Urzikstan is that as well as the gameplay can work and as good as the cover systems are throughout the map and the density that it offers, it is a unique feeling, and there aren't really many areas in Urzikstan that I'm going to remember in a year or two's time. But we are talking about two very different eras. We're talking about an era of Warzone where movement wasn't as important as it is today. An era where we used to have stopping power ammunition that used to do double the damage and kill you instantaneously. An era of Warzone where airstrikes actually would genuinely go through buildings and murder people, which alleviated a lot of camping in a way, but it wasn't very consistent. And good god, an era of Warzone where the audio and anti-cheat was so bad and non-existent that it makes today's version look like a goddamn godsend in comparison. My point is generally that the systems of Warzone have fundamentally changed. We have redeploy balloons now, we have flares, we have a new advanced 360 movement system coming to the game. We also have an entirely new movement system that's going to have more demands of interior designs of buildings and more demands of the areas around it to cater towards that movement system. The larger points of interest in Verdansk aren't really a huge concern for me, because I really do feel like a lot of them do cater very well towards wide open gameplay with good spaces for rotations and gunfights, but some of the more compact buildings with one stairwell, with no hallways, with cover, with, very simplistic and basic designs, could be problematic for omnimovement. We are talking about corridors that aren't really wide enough to fit the gameplay that we're talking about. We're talking about spaces with zero cover that don't exactly work hand in hand with a movement system that's designed to benefit cover systems. I mean, we are talking about a version of Verdansk that had, entire sets of blocks and buildings where the only way to access them was a single stairwell. And if you didn't have control of the top of that building, there was basically no way to get rid of the team on the top of the building. I don't even want to think about what bunker busters are going to look like in Verdansk because I know they're going to be messy. Now I'm going to put the yapping aside. My overarching point being is that Verdansk actually is a really iconic map, and it is a lot of fun. I do wish I was seeing something new and brand new, and I really hope we see Avalon sooner rather than later. But Verdansk is Verdansk, and it does have some really cool moments. But it is, good god, not perfect, and I see so many people talk about this map like it was God's never-ending saving grace with rose-tinted glasses from 7 miles back. Verdansk was a good map, but there are areas of it that are completely underutilized, areas of it that are basically barren and useless, and areas of it that pretty much make no sense. And that's what I want to talk about in this video today. I still think we need to keep to the traditional core of what Verdansk is, because at a fundamental level, that's what people are expecting. But there's no reason why, with a little dash of flavor here and the odd change here or there, that the map can't greatly be improved in a lot of subtle ways that benefit the game. I mean, if it was down to elitists, we would probably have a version of Verdansk that doesn't even have a stadium open. We're going to reach a point around early 2025 where you're going to have a really confusing system where old fans are coming back because Verdansk is in the game, but they're embracing an entirely different fundamental basis of Warzone, a new movement system, new metas, new ways that the game works. So having those two systems mesh together could either work really well or be a complete disaster. And that's what this video is hopefully going to address. So let's talk about the ways that Verdansk needs to update in 2025. The bonus being is that it already exists in Warzone Mobile, which is a shared engine with the current version of Call of Duty anyway, so you're very likely going to see a lot of the general work from Warzone Mobile ported across to the current version of Warzone. When looking at Verdansk, the first thing that I would generally change is some of the dead space. Now, what I mean by dead space is dead space that doesn't serve a purpose, not dead space that serves a purpose. For example, dead space that serves a purpose is the low ground here on Prison. This is ultimately dead space, but it exists because it's a deliberate downside from being in the prison itself, or an advantage if the zone happens to pull away and create some really interesting scenarios. Now, I do feel like this area could be slightly better designed. There could be a better transition from port to prison, for example. There could be a few more trenches and gullies just to give you a little bit more cover, just a little something really to make it a bit more interactive. But it is an area that generally actually serves a purpose, a very distinct and obvious idea that if you're in prison or not in prison, there are pluses or minuses. Likewise, the hillside at Hospital. There is absolutely nothing happening on this entire hillside. It's completely useless and barren, but it deliberately serves as a height advantage over Hospital and train station, and even these buildings over here south of Superstore to some extent. So this is what I would consider to be not dead space. They're areas that could be reworked and could have a little bit of improvement to them. A good example is some of the transitions around here from train station and some of the transitions around here where there's just not a huge amount of cover, but a little bit. But they don't not serve a purpose. They have reasons for them. They exist there for certain reasons. The areas I'm talking about are the areas that serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. For example, this entire outer side of the entire map here on the west side of Verdansk from Boneyard and Promenade West is more or less entirely useless. I mean, I've probably been there a handful of times over the many years that I was playing Verdansk, and I really feel like this area in particular could just do with a huge redesign. Whether that's making it more interesting, adding something that gives it a bit more pizzazz, or even just increasing the building density out in this general direction. A more rogue idea, because there will likely be a train system that goes through Verdansk again, would be to extend the train track out this side and have a series of train stations moving along here that interconnect with Boneyard and Airport. That could be something that could be done to make this entire west side a little bit more interesting, because right now, it doesn't really serve a huge purpose. I would like the idea of potentially having the rail track from train station extend out here to the west, go all the way up to the edge of Dam and sort of terminate where it normally terminated before and link back up. That could be a cool idea, but this is just a dead space area that needs something done with it. The hills at the south could maybe do with a building or two more. This was an area that wasn't necessarily dead space. There was some good cover, especially around this hillside here, but a little bit more generally throughout this spread could be quite good. But there are some other areas of interest that I feel really generally need some love. The biggest one for me is this area, this entire section between Quarry, Stadium, and Lumber. Now, there's a bit of a density here with the main warehouse building, which I did enjoy, and I do have fond memories of that, and the radar array to some extent did offer a height position, but this whole side of the map, almost like an eighth of the map really, is just really barren and doesn't really serve much purpose. It's not interesting, it isn't a fun area to fight in, there's basically no cover, and whilst I'm not saying absolutely everything must be dripping in cover and gameplay design, at the bare minimum, making it more interesting would be cool. So for example, this is actually part of the system, the drainage system that leads up into a waterway. Why not add more or less elevation and make it something like a rapid fall system where there's some really rushing water, some zip lines going across the waterways, just something to make it a bit more fun and a bit more interactive, and throw in a few more buildings, a few more obstacle courses, or hell, even make it some sort of like treehouse style scenario, you know, like a you know, I don't know, what the hell are these tough mudder guys doing these days? Something like that up here would be pretty sweet. Just something to make the area more interesting and more appealing, whilst also making it more functional, because that's some of the setbacks of areas like Verdansk. Now, the next thing for me is this area here, in and around military base. There's two here that I want to touch on. The first one is this U-bend between Dam and Millie base. It actually has some really good hillsides that do serve purposes for overwatching Dam, but the U-bend itself can maybe do with a little bit more love. It was very one-dimensional in terms of gameplay. It was very open with pretty much no like obscure cover, no trees, no nothing that kept you safe, and that could do with some work. And the other one is in between military base and this compound building here. I actually really like this area, especially when they added a crashed airplane into the middle of it to offer some loot scenarios. And if they made that a little bit more dense, maybe made the forest itself more dense, and continued giving more intrigue with things like crashed planes, crashed helicopters, I think that could be really, really cool. Now, those are the areas of dead space that I can think about and touch on very obviously. There is something to be said about the west side of farmland as well, and not the best ideal location, but at least the waterways compensate for that somewhat. This general drainage system gives it a little bit of a something in terms of a transition, but maybe having a few more ducks heading out towards farmland could be an idea. But that's pretty much it in terms of dead space. Now, Verdansk as a map does have some areas that distinctly lack all sorts of cover whatsoever. You only need to think about the northeast side of airport, where you just have this huge transition over here, or this transition from train station to boneyard, or even just really any transition from port or farmland to prison. But sometimes some of those serve gameplay purposes. You know, they're meant to be risky transitions, they're meant to cause gameplay problems. So you don't necessarily want to eviscerate all of those things, but in areas where the map just has zero density and zero love, those are the areas I see that need improvement. Now, the next big thing for me is addressing some of the building design throughout all of Verdansk. There are some serious issues with how some of these buildings operate that just don't fit or align with the modern day expectations of what Warzone has to offer. I mean, you just need to look at downtown, right? If you go into downtown, you had this building here, which had a one ladder rooftop. You had these buildings here, which I believe were one laddered rooftops as well. You had this gigantic block over here, which was pretty much a one ladder entryway. So was that one. There were very few buildings that actually had more than one way to access them. This building had a stairwell and I believe a zipline elevator shaft and a couple of zippies on the sides. This building and hospital had a few options in terms of how you could get to the roof, and some of the buildings did offer a few directional ways for you to challenge them. But far too many buildings throughout the entirety of Verdansk were super one-dimensional. These long red buildings only had one stairwell through them, sometimes two stairwells through them, but even so, they were very easily camped. And camping was a huge problem in Verdansk that I don't think people really realized was as big of a problem as it was. And we have to bear in mind, this was back in the days where airstrikes were broken and could end up airstriking somebody through a building, so you'd get away with a couple of instances of killing a camper. Modern Warzone has bunker busters. Modern Warzone has all of these new things and kill streaks in them. We don't know if they're necessarily staying for the Warzone Verdansk integration, but even just things like zip lines and how redeploy balloons work completely change how some of these buildings are going to have to operate. I really feel like a lot of the buildings are going to need a little bit of love and technicality in terms of how you access the rooftops and how you can challenge those buildings, and less of them need single ladder entryways that basically just mean whoever's up there ends up winning the game. Warzone's changed a lot in this time, and the basic philosophy that if you get into a position, you win that position is just not something I can deal with. Especially this ATC tower. Good God. If this ATC tower releases and there is only one zip line on the interior to get to the roof of it, I might be head lost, bro. I'll be real. I will be stowing 75 bunker busters and buying them myself just to deal with that tower. It's just something that I feel needs addressing going into Verdansk. Some of those buildings that were just way too simple to camp. I mean, some of these buildings were really well designed. I mean, these two buildings down here, for example, south of Superstore, lots of really interesting fights between them. You could parachute between them as well in order to access them if you managed to get a pick on somebody. They were really well thought out. But some of the other buildings in the game were just one-way disasters. I think this one in downtown is probably the biggest egregious example of that. I'm pretty sure this only had a single stairwell in order to access the roof, and the other was potentially a ladder, but like it was just the easiest to defend rooftop of all around. And I just don't think that's something that we need going into the new version of Verdansk. Now, in terms of Verdansk, there were some changes that were made to it that made it more interesting, arguably Stadium being opened up, and I would be bitterly disappointed if Stadium was closed going into the remaster of this. You know, I really feel like it's something that should be opened back up again, and I don't think they should be copying one for one in terms of what previous Warzone was doing, and arguably in a lot of ways, Verdansk 84 was better than Verdansk. There were some really good changes, especially in terms of the radar array, the stadium, and actually the prison itself got a pretty hefty redesign that made it a bit more interesting. The only other thing I can think of really is I'd like to see a little bit more cover throughout the whole of Verdansk. Now look, I'm not saying that Verdansk needs to be this sort of, you know, speedball style paintball arena where there's always cover and you're never punished for making a rotation or transition. But I just really feel like there are some areas in Verdansk that if you take off the rose-tinted glasses, good God, were they terrible to maneuver from. Moving anywhere around Stadium, nightmare. Moving anywhere around the north side of Hospital, nightmare. This entire west side of the map, absolute nightmare if you weren't in Boneyard or in Storage Town or in Airport. Complete write-off. If you weren't in Millie Base or in this building, the entire surroundings for this, nightmare. They just didn't have a lot of cover in them. Nowhere near the amount of something like Urzikstan, or hell, even the amount Caldera offered in some respects. And it doesn't even need to be, okay, well, we're throwing in some bollards or we're throwing in some hard cover. Even just adding some subtle hillsides or a little bit of elevation here and there could greatly improve how this map flows and plays, especially when you consider all the new systems that are coming into Verdansk. That's about it for the design changes. I'm really curious to see you guys' thoughts and feelings about Verdansk in the comment section below, whether you're somebody who really wants to see it just be an exact carbon copy of what it was, or somebody who wants to see it change and why. Let me know down below, and I'll see you again in the next one.